Thanks so much, Charlie. That was fantastic. Sorry for the video turmoil, everyone. But I did want to introduce Michael Day from the Greenville Home Builders Association.
Thank you, Lisa. I work for an organization that represents the very industry that, in addition to providing housing for families that live in our community, they're the companies that have to implement all of the various ideas, ordinances, regulations, everything that our community puts in place to address what we want and how our community develops, which is the subject of what we're talking about here. And so there's two components to what they have to address, whether you're a developer who's preparing a subdivision or an apartment complex or something like that, or you're a home builder who's building the dwelling itself. They have to deal with our community's vision of what we want our community to look like, and then they also have to deal with what the consumer actually wants to buy. And those can often be two opposing points of view. And so as we were preparing for this event here, our national association, the National Association of Home Builders, had just completed the consumer preference study that they do every year and have done so for more than 20 years. And in this particular instance, they increased the sampling size pretty dramatically so that they could break it down by demographic. And specifically, what we all wanted to know is what are millennials going to do? Millennials are, have been the laggards in terms of coming into the housing market. They've been very slow to form households, and the running joke among home builders is they're still living in mom's basement. And that's true to a certain extent. I just kicked two of mine out. So pleased to do that. And so we looked at that and saw that as an opportunity to not only find out about how we can modify our thinking about growth management, but we can also look at what the next big wave of consumers who are going to demand housing, what it is that they're going to demand. And so we invited Rob Dietz, who's Vice President of Economics at the National Association of Home Builders, to come to Greenville and talk about that study and what it specifically says. But before he comes up here, I wanted to just give you a couple of thoughts. I've been working at this for quite a while. I've worked for home builders associations for about 20 years. And the thing that I can tell you that has been consistent in every conversation for the last 20 years when it comes to growth management is the word sprawl. We talk about sprawl all the time. 20 years ago, as we were talking about sprawl, what I could tell you about consumer demand is that was what consumers were demanding. They were demanding sprawl. They were buying sprawl. We're seeing somewhat of a change in that, and I think we've seen it in some of the recent measurements that Greenville has been the beneficiary of. The American Institute of Planners does a sprawl index every several years, and Greenville has actually improved on that list, which is actually fairly rare. There aren't that many communities that have done that. But we talk about sprawl all the time, and the one point that I want to leave you with is, how do you define sprawl? And I think the best way to define it is this, and I want you to keep this in mind as Rob is speaking. Sprawl, in my definition, is, do you have to burn a gallon of gas to buy a gallon of milk? And that's an important point because we often talk about how far people have to drive to work, but it's only 20% of all the commutes that are made by us in our community. The other 80% of our trips are trips to the stores, trips to the restaurant, trips to the park, trips to the mall. They're all discretionary trips. And those are the ones that we need to plan around, because the consumer preferences that we're seeing is, while people still may be willing to drive a distance to go to work, they're less willing to drive long distances for the amenities that they want to consume. And then one last thing that I want you to think about, and that is the definition of urban versus suburban. You'll see Rob talk a bit about choices about suburban living. Let's make sure we understand that in our community, suburban can be anything from out in Simpsonville, quite frankly, North Main Street. We may think of North Main or Augusta Street as being urban, but it's really not. It's the first wave of suburban. And so as Rob goes through his presentation, just bear that in mind, that it's kind of hard sometimes to check that subtle difference in what a consumer preference is when we're thinking in terms of urban and suburban. So with that, Rob Dietz.
We'll try to compete with the rain. Can everybody hear me? Well, good afternoon. As Michael said, I'm going to go through sort of the state of national home building in terms of trends, what builders are building right now, as a lead up to some of the consumer preference data that indicates what we think millennial home buyers will want in terms of housing, both rental housing and owner-occupied housing. So the first thing is that, as Michael mentioned, millennials are experiencing what we call the great delay. The great delay being delays in marriage, delays in home ownership that occurred after the Great Recession. The preference data I'm going to go through indicates that they still have the same life cycle goals, marriage, kids, owning their own home, but they're going to do it at years later in age than prior generations. Part of that is fallout of the Great Recession, bad job market. Some of it's structural. I think more of it's cyclical and business cycle related, but there are some structural changes. Now, when we think about the sort of key driver of housing demand, both rental and owner-occupied, we're really thinking about household formations. And I like this graph because it really illustrates what we've seen in terms of the demographics of housing demand nationwide since the recession. The high bars here off to the left represent the household formations that took place during the housing boom. We were seeing on average about 1.4 million net households forming a year, with about 12% of that net growth being due to growth in rental stock. Since then, it's fallen off to about 500,000 a year. We've seen a little bit of an uptick in recent years, but the last 2 quarters finally showing some growth. That's a kind of a source of optimism, both for rental demand and owner-occupied demand. After essentially years of kids living in their parents' basement, we had really diminished household formations and took a big toll on millennials. The impact on home sales is obvious. For existing homes, our friends at the realtors say that typically existing home sales, 40% should be to first-time buyers. It's currently 30%. The decline for new home sales is even larger. We typically see about 30% of new home sales going to first-time buyers nationwide, and it's, according to NHB survey data, right around 16%. So we're operating at about half of what we usually see in first-time buyers. And I think that's a consequence of that great delay. The impacts in terms of what home builders are actually building actually kind of stark. Typically, we expect 4 out of 5 housing units being built by builders to be single-family. Right now, it's only 2/3. So we have a recovery in home building that's really been driven by multifamily in a few years. And again, the question is, at least with respect to consumer preferences, does that reflect a structural change in the kinds of homes that are being demanded, or is it a cyclical response coming out of the Great Recession? So if we take a look at the kinds of homes being built, I think we see some of the impacts here in the market. This is new single-family median and average home size. And what you see is a trend up during the boom years, then a dip during the Great Recession as builders shrank homes to try to make them a little more affordable to try to sell them, and then growth during the post-recession period. Now that growth doesn't necessarily reflect changes in preferences. It reflects changes in the buyer of homes that builders have been servicing. Fewer first-time buyers, or wealthier, higher income buyers. So the median home, the home right in the middle of the distribution of actual homes being sold, has been larger. Now, this isn't a sign, this growth isn't a sign of market strength. It's actually a sign of market weakness that we've had this diminished participation by first-time buyers. The result is that builders in recent years have been building homes with more bedrooms and more bathrooms. And it's just consistent with this notion that they've been serving a buyer who's higher up in the income distribution. Custom home building, in terms of market share, the blue line is market share. We have a trend of declining custom building. This is homes built on an owner's lot or by the builder or by the homeowner as the contractor. It's actually rebounded during the recession. This was because spec home building was on the decline. Multifamily unit size, down. The reason it's been down, and it's basically been down for the last few years, is a higher rate of rental demand. The condo market is basically shut down. In fact, the recent orders in terms of multifamily production, 95% rental, only 5% for sale multifamily. I would argue this goes back to the fact that we're seeing cyclical effects and the consumer preferences are going to snap back to the results of this year. I'm going to skip a few of these. Townhouse construction, growing trend over recent years, took a bit of a dip after the recession, the blue line, then they're kind of going up and down recently. I think this might be a place to take a look when we see those first-time buyers come back into the new home market. We'll see stronger growth in townhouse construction. Although it's important to point out, if you look at that secondary y-axis, we're still only talking about 10% of the marketplace. It's a niche market. It's a signal, but it doesn't really represent a significant change. So what do we think will happen with home size going forward? Well, we've had a lot of good job numbers recently. There's been some moves to loosen up the credit box, and home prices have been moderating. So we think that means that for 2015 and 2016, that's good news for prospective first-time home buyers, and we are going to see a greater share of new home sales going to those buyers. They will, however, demand a slightly different product, slightly smaller, more affordable, and as we'll see, one that is closer to amenities. Now, this is survey data from actual builders in terms of the top features they're looking at in homes, and I kind of included this in the mix. It's not just for millennials, but all home buyers. It's worth noting that you see a large number of energy-efficient items in this. This is obviously a growing market. Home buyers are expecting energy efficiency, and it's one of the benefits of new construction that you can get a home, even though it might be priced a little bit more, it will have reduced utility bills. That might be tougher for millennials to get into as an entry buyer who might be more sensitive to price and maybe discount the long-run benefits of those utility cost reductions going forward. So then getting to the actual survey data that we have, what kind of homes are millennial home buyers looking at? Well, this is prospective buyers who are renters right now, and 75% of them want the single-family home. In other words, not a big change with current conditions. Only 1 in 10, approximately, want a townhouse. I live in a townhouse outside of Washington, D.C. I'm in the minority. Most buyers do want that single-family home. And only 4% want a for-sale purchase multifamily apartment. That is a definite minority. And that has to do with the lifestyle. People are getting married, having kids, they want the yard. Want amenities close to parks, they don't want to deal with elevators and that sort of thing when you have a growing family. In terms of the area that millennial home buyers want to live in, the suburbs, just as in prior generations, comes out of tops. 2/3 want to be in the suburbs, 24% want to be in rural. And I think it's important to keep in mind, as sort of Michael mentioned, what we think of in terms of the suburbs and rural. Suburbs here includes inner suburbs, areas that might have urban concentrations, urban villages with a commercial center that's in walking distance, but more of a suburban feel outside the central business. And rural would include that exterior suburb. So, this is kind of a broad-based suburban feel. Only 10% of the respondents in the survey wanted central city living in the dedicated central business district where there is residential. A primary reason for buying a new home is gaining space. Typically, we find that on a per capita basis, people need about 800 square foot in a house per person. So, you might have a couple that's currently in a 1 or 2 bedroom apartment, 1,700 square feet. They want to move to a home that's just above 2,400 square feet, looking down the road when they might have a kid or two. So that desire for new home size is another important element for the millennial home buyer. They want 3 or 4 bedrooms. Again, life cycle, wanting to have kids, wanting to have marriage, but doing these things later in life. Although they're happier with maybe only 2.5 bathrooms, they don't need the large home that the early buyer is looking for right now. I mentioned energy efficiency. High percentage of younger home buyers saying they want energy efficiency, but then when you introduce the fact that it might increase the cost of the home, they back away from it. You might argue it's short-sighted. It could just be what economists call the income factor. They're sensitive to that initial purchase price. They're discounting the future costs of the utilities, so they might forego the home that offers solar panels or high energy efficiency insulation to get into the home in the first place, and maybe look forward down the road to doing this exercise. The big thing though, they're looking for amenities. We've listed some here. Over half of millennial home buyers looking for walkability to parks, walking trails, playgrounds, outdoor swimming pools. So that feature of they want suburban houses, they want to retain home ownership, but they want walkability to those amenities. I think is a key feature of this survey. And then what are they willing to trade off in order to get into a home? Unfinished spaces, that's obviously been popular for generations. Some are willing to accept longer commutes, longer distances to shopping and entertainment, and then down at the bottom of the list, less expensive materials and a smaller house. Again, the desire for home ownership to get in that single family house in the suburbs is really that desire for space. Trust but verify. I walked you through the NHB survey, but it's been interesting. We've seen a raft of these sort of millennial surveys recently. Fannie Mae did one recently showing that homeownership retains its popularity. The Demand Institute last year did one. Again, similar numbers, basically 3/4 of respondents saying they wanted homeownership. They thought it was an excellent goal. And then just this past week, I didn't make a slide for it, but a week ago, the Urban Land Institute released survey results showing the same thing. Single family home, they want homeownership, but they're likely to do it later than prior generations. So in terms of the forecast, where do we think that the housing market is going forward? This is the NHB Builder Confidence Measure that comes out every month. Builders are fairly confident, and they do see growth in the single-family market. I mean, it really kind of tells the story of where home building has been over the last few years. We suffered an 80% decline in the Great Recession. Meager growth since then. It's been a multifamily-led recovery thus far. We're seeing about 9% growth in single-family starts, and then very substantial growth in 2016 as that improving job market encourages those younger millennials who are currently renters to become home buyers. Even with that 39% growth rate in 2016, we will only be at 81% of normal single-family construction levels. Normal here defined by 2000, 2003 levels, which was roughly a good period in terms of population growth and the need to replace older housing. So, the question is, when will the home building recovery nationwide end and we get back to normal conditions? Not until at least 2017. So this has been a long, painful progress. The Great Delay has definitely had an impact on what's being built, but we do see the growth for single family because that's where those millennial buyers are going to go. And then I just wanted to end with a positive element of why we think that positive outlook is based on fact. It's the demographics. And I like this slide. It's a little difficult to read, but basically you've got age on the x-axis, and then the blue line is the count of people at that age. So the y-axis is the count of millions. And you've got the boxes defined by the black lines, roughly the generational groups. So the born of 46 to 64, that third group to the right, your baby boomers. So you've got your Gen Xers, 65 to 78. Notice that little gap where it dips down to about 3.8 million. That's kind of where I am there at age 40. There's a bit of a dip in terms of Gen Xers. Interestingly, that happened just during the period in which housing demand fell off. You had a dip in the population in their prime home buying years. The yellow box is the key household formation age period, roughly age 25 to 34. That's when people go from about 16% being an independent either homeowner or renter to 50%. In other words, moving out from college dorms, their parents' basements and so forth. So basically, you can imagine this graph moving to the right. And notice what we're about ready to have pushed into that yellow box, that 4.7 million. That's the peak of the millennials. There's lots of them. It's going to be really good for housing demand. It's Doing really good for multifamily demand right now. I would argue that's both cyclical and part of the life cycle as they prepare themselves for home ownership. And what that means is in 2016 and 2017, it's going to be really good news for single-family existing home sales and single-family construction. And then if you're looking for the roots in the next housing crisis, you might look all the way to the left. Bit of a dip there for those under age 5. And that's also a result of the Great Recession. We had 3 of the lowest years of birth rates due to this great delay. Those millennials will start having kids, and there will be another dip up in the years ahead. But we will have a fall off in housing demand maybe 13 years from now. But looking forward, we've got some really good years ahead for housing, and I think that means good times for single-family construction in particular. So just a summary, growth ahead for home construction. Gen Y aspires to home ownership, all the surveys indicated. The preferences are strong for single family and suburban housing, but one with amenities nearby that they can walk to. And, eventually the need for energy efficient housing, even though millennials seem to be price sensitive to it right now, that may be an item for remodeling. And that is the end. So thank you very much.